Here is the full speech for the title, A Woman with No Friends, written in the style of Carl Jung without mentioning him directly. The tone is introspective, symbolic, and psychologically profound, intended for a motivational voiceover that honors inner transformation through solitude. There exists a sacred and often misunderstood silence within the feminine psyche, a solitude not born of abandonment, but of necessity. It is not simply the absence of others, but the deliberate withdrawal from a world that demands too much and offers too little in return. The woman who enters this inner stillness does so not because she is unloved, but because she can no longer survive on borrowed identities. In a culture that idealizes constant connection, social performance, and external affirmation, the woman who turns inward is perceived as lost, yet in truth, she is the one seeking to be found, not by others, but by herself. Her solitude becomes a womb, space for transformation, a psychic chamber where the false layers of expectation, duty, and image can finally begin to dissolve. In this sacred isolation, she is not weak. On the contrary, she is engaging in one of the most courageous acts available to the human soul, the refusal to distract herself from her own depths. She does not flee the discomfort of silence. She does not beg the world to fill her loneliness. She descends willingly into the underworld of her own being, where the archetypes whisper, where the forgotten self lives, where the soul stirs with ancient memory. This is the realm where she sheds her roles, the dutiful daughter, the perfect partner, the agreeable friend, and begins to sense something else beneath it all, a wildness, a wisdom, a knowing that has long been exiled. She touches the feminine not as a social role, but as an inner force, cyclical, mysterious, fertile, and fierce. The solitude allows her to listen, not to the voices of the crowd, but to the subtle rhythms of her own nature. Here she may confront her wounds, not as defects to hide, but as portals to power. She may meet her rage not as a threat, but as a buried truth. She may face her longing, not as a weakness, but as a compass pointing home. Alone, she learns to differentiate between the noise of the world and the song of her own soul. She begins to trust what arises from within, not because it is easy, but because it is real. In this place, the feminine psyche uncoils from centuries of suppression and starts to breathe again, quietly at first, then with the force of something inevitable. This solitude is not loneliness. It is initiation. It is a return to what the world has taught her to forget. It is the beginning of a remembering, the gathering of all the pieces of herself that were scattered across years of compromise. She is no longer content to be fragmented, decorated, palatable. She longs to be whole. To exist as a woman in the world is often to live behind a mask, a persona carefully shaped to fit the expectations of others. This persona is not born of deceit, but of survival. It is crafted over time through the demands of family, culture, religion, and history. It smiles when it must, softens its voice, tames its instincts, and bows before the altar of acceptance. It becomes what the world needs it to be, even if it means losing the thread of the true self in the process. The collective persona is seductive. It offers safety, praise, belonging, but at what cost? There comes a moment, quiet but undeniable, when the weight of the mask becomes unbearable. A woman begins to feel the fracture inside, the widening gap between the self she performs and the self she truly is. This tension grows slowly at first, a whisper in her bones, a restlessness in her spirit, until it rises like a tide and demands to be faced, and then she refuses, not in anger, but in awakening. She begins to say no, not only to others, but to the version of herself she once believed was necessary. She stops laughing at what no longer amuses her. She stops pleasing out of fear. She withdraws from shallow performances, from obligatory connections, from social rituals that feel like cages draped in silk. To the outside world, this rejection appears abrupt, even hostile. She may be labeled distant, cold, difficult. But in truth, she is peeling away the false layers. She is standing at the edge of her constructed identity and letting it fall, piece by piece, until only essence remains. This is not a rebellion against society. It is a homecoming to the soul. Yet the cost is real. The persona, after all, served a function. It offered access, opportunity, comfort, and when she sets it down, she may find herself isolated, misunderstood, even exiled. Friends may disappear. Family may question her. The world may recoil from the woman who no longer plays along. Because when a woman sheds her persona, she becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous in a world that thrives on control. But the rejection of the collective persona is not destruction. It is revelation. It is a shedding of illusion in order to encounter truth. Not the tidy truth of social convention, but the raw, complex, embodied truth of who she really is beneath the role. And in that space, stripped of performance, she begins to sense her own power, not the power given by others, but the power that has always lived within her, waiting for the silence, the courage, the solitude required for its return. She is no longer a reflection of others' desires. She is no longer a canvas for their projections. She is no longer responsible for protecting their comfort. She is becoming a mirror of the real. When a woman finds herself alone, truly alone, beyond distraction, beyond performance, beyond noise, she enters a realm most spend their lives avoiding, the underworld of the psyche. It is here, in the silence of isolation, that the shadows begin to stir. Not shadows cast by others, but her own, the forgotten, disowned, and rejected parts of her being. The world teaches her to curate herself, to be pleasing, to be composed, to be desirable, digestible, disciplined. In this process, she learns to hide her grief behind a smile, her rage behind politeness, her desires behind modesty, her ambition behind apology. These exiled parts do not disappear. They gather in the dark, forming what we call the shadow. And in isolation, without the mirror of society to distract her, she is forced to look into this shadowed mirror. She sees the child who was never held, the lover who betrayed her, the mother who could not love her, the self who betrayed herself again and again just to be wanted. These images do not arrive to torment her. They arrive because they are her. They knock on the door not to harm her, but to be integrated, to be seen, to be heard at last. At first, there is resistance, the impulse to run, to numb, to return to the shallow safety of surface living. But something in her is tired of running. Something in her wants to know, wants to see it all, even the parts she was taught to deny. The rage she repressed becomes a teacher of boundaries. The jealousy she disowned becomes a cry for unacknowledged hunger. The sadness she buried becomes a map to forgotten tenderness. Each shadow is a message, a guide, a fragment of the soul longing to return. And so, she begins the sacred task of sitting with what others flee. She listens to the stories written in her scars. She welcomes the voices that once terrified her. The false self begins to crack, and through those cracks light enters. But it is not a light from above. It is the light that was hidden within the shadow all along. There is no savior in this process. No guide but the intuitive flame flickering within. She must walk through the fire alone, but in doing so, she becomes something more than what the world sees. She becomes whole, not perfect, but integrated, not polished, but authentic. Her loneliness becomes a temple. Her fear becomes a threshold. Her shadow becomes her teacher. And in time, as she learns to sit beside the darkness without judgment, she begins to feel something shift. The monsters lose their teeth, the grief loses its edge, the shame loses its power. She is not erasing her wounds, she is honoring them. She is not defeating the shadow, she is making peace with it. Because within the very things she feared, the very selves she buried, lie the pieces of her deepest truth, and only in facing them, only in the alchemy of this silent inner confrontation, can she ever be free. There is a turning point in the soul's descent, a quiet threshold beyond the masks, beyond the grief, beyond the scattered shadows, where something ancient begins to stir, not a solution, not a cure, but a union. The slow, sacred process of becoming whole. This is not a transformation one performs for others to see. It does not announce itself with grand gestures or sudden awakenings. It unfolds in silence, in the dark, in solitude, and it resembles alchemy, not the turning of lead into gold in the physical world, but the transmutation of fragmentation into unity within the psyche. In this inner crucible, opposing forces, once in conflict, begin to lean toward each other. The feminine and the masculine, the wild and the tame, the nurturer and the destroyer, the light and the shadow, they begin to dance rather than fight. They begin to speak rather than accuse. They begin to weave a deeper tapestry of truth that transcends identity. She who once rejected her anger now sees it as a boundary drawn in flame. She who once buried her softness now sees it as strength in its purest form. She who once sought wholeness in others now discovers it was always a possibility within. This is the alchemy, not becoming someone else, but remembering what she already is. To unite the inner world is not to perfect it. It is to hold paradox without fracture, to say, I am joy and I am sorrow. I am desire and I am restraint. I am divine and I am wounded. I am sacred and I am raw. The woman on this path learns to sit in the center of herself, not as an observer, but as a witness to a slow rebirth. The fire that once consumed her now refines her. The silence that once tormented her now speaks in riddles and revelations. She becomes the priestess of her own becoming, lighting the candles in rooms of her soul she once feared to enter. The union is not something she achieves. It is something she allows. It emerges not from force, but from surrender, from the relinquishing of old ideals, inherited roles, and fractured self-images. What remains is not perfection but presence, a presence so complete, so rooted, that she no longer chases love, validation, or purpose. She radiates it. In this alchemical space, time becomes nonlinear. Old wounds reappear not to harm but to be reseen. Memories become mirrors, dreams become messages. Intuition becomes the language of the soul. She does not need the external world to reflect her value, because she now knows it through direct encounter with the self that has always lived beneath the noise. It is here, somewhere between breath and silence, between the known and the unknowable, that she discovers a different kind of power. Not dominance, not control, but integration, the power of wholeness, the power of one who no longer needs to divide herself to survive. The world may still misunderstand her, friends may remain few, loneliness may visit like a winter wind, but it no longer defines her because she has seen the mystery, she has stood in the fire, she has tasted the gold not given by the world but forged by her own becoming.